In the last lecture, we added CSS transitions. Now, one obvious thing we can use instead is a CSS animation. Now, in case you're not aware, a CSS animation also has nothing to do with React. A CSS animation simply allows you to define a bit of a more complex and controlled animation than with the transition prop. Because with the transition prop, we're just saying, hey, whenever any property changes, animate that change and figure out how to animate it on your own, basically. Now, an animation, a CSS animation, is a detailedly described set of steps you want to execute. For that, you create so-called keyframes with add keyframes. Then you give these keyframes any name of your choice, like open modal. And then here, you can define the steps, so inside the animation, in percentages, or just with from and to if you only got two. But we could say we want to start at 0%, and then that's the syntax. Then we want to have a certain state at, let's say, 50% of the animation, and we want to end with another state. Now, inside these states, you use normal CSS properties to describe how the object should look like at this point of time. So since this is the open modal animation, we can say when opening it, we're starting at an opacity of 0, and we transformed this to be moved up to the top. Now let's say at 50% of the time, we want to have an opacity of 1, so it's fully visible, but we actually move this 20% to the bottom. So it's not in the final position, but actually moved a little bit too far down. And only at 100%, we move it to its final destination with translate 0. Now with that, we can use open modal in our modal open class, because this is the class which gets attached when the modal should be shown. And I no longer need to set opacity and transform here. Instead here I call animation. That's a special property which now allows us to define a set of keyframes which should be executed whenever this CSS class is present on an element. And that of course includes when it is added to an element. So here I want to execute the open modal animation. Then again, we need to define a timing. So let's say we want to show this over 0.3 seconds, or maybe 0.4. Then we also can define an easing function here, which defines how it moves between our individual steps here. And we also have to define if it should repeat this animation or end at the state we end at in this animation. If we don't define anything, it would jump back to the starting state once the animation played through. If we want to keep the final state, so the 100% state, we actually have to add the forwards value here so that it keeps the final animation step. Now with that, if we save this file and I click open modal, you see it bumps a little bit. It slides down and then slides up. Do you see this tiny bump here? That is because we push it 20% down after 50%. If you can't see it, let's simply increase this to 90%, and then it should be really easy to see. Now if we open the modal, you see it jump down much further and then move back up again. So now we're using a CSS animation, and we're taking advantage of the fact that this is simply added or played when this class is added. Now for closing, we can of course also define a set of keyframes. So let's quickly add close modal here. And now we want to play the opposite. So we start at an opacity of 1 and are at the position, well, the element sits at. After 50%, we maybe have an opacity of, let's say, 0.8, so still quite visible. But we slit this down a little bit. And then after 100%, we got an opacity of 0, and we move this out of the screen with minus 100% on translate Y. Now we only need to use the close modal animation, and like for modal open, we make sure that this gets added whenever the modal closed class is added. So there we play the close modal keyframe set. Now with that, if we save this, let's see it in action. Opening works as before. Dismissing also now plays our animation. And that is of course quite nice, because now we're again controlling everything with CSS, but we got more control than with the transition property, because the CSS animation property allows us to play our own set of keyframes, which we do here. And again, this has nothing to do with React, but it is important to recognize that this doesn't make it worse or bad. You can absolutely use that. And in a lot of cases, CSS animations might give you all the power you need to achieve certain animations or looks.